A boot crashed through the front window of a diner. Glass sprayed across the counter. A second man swept his arm along a shelf, and a row of coffee mugs exploded on the floor. Somebody flipped a booth table on its side. A fist came next. It caught an old man across the mouth and dropped him onto the tile. He didn't cry out. He didn't swing back. He pushed himself up on one knee, spat blood on the floor, and reached for the coffee pot that had rolled under the stool. That old man was Roy Merrick. 68 years old, gray at the temples. And the four punks laughing over him had no idea what that faded patch above the pie case really meant. What happened when those men came back the next morning left the whole town of Coalfork holding its breath. Stay with me on this one. Roy Merrick opened the Coalfork diner every morning at 5, same as he had for 22 years. He flipped the sign, fired up the grill, and set a bowl of fresh water down by the register for Sarge, the three-legged German shepherd who slept in a patch of sun near the pie case. Sarge had lost that back leg a long time ago. Roy never told anybody how, and after a while people stopped asking. Coalfork was the kind of Arizona town you'd miss if you blinked. One long strip of Main Street. A gas station. A hardware store run by a widow named Fran. A church with a bell that didn't work anymore. And the diner, sitting at the far end like an anchor, its windows fogged with bacon steam before the sun even cleared the ridge. Roy wasn't a big talker. He was a big man, though. Even at 68, his hands looked like they could bend a horseshoe. Thick forearms, a gray beard cut close. He moved slow, but it was the kind of slow that made you look twice because underneath it there was still something coiled, something patient. The regulars loved him. Truckers coming off the interstate, old ranchers, kids who didn't have breakfast at home and somehow always found a full plate in front of them at Roy's counter, no charge, no questions. He'd slide it over and say, "Eat up." Growing boy. And that was that. Now here's the thing you need to understand about Coalfork that year. It was dying slow, and then all at once it started dying fast, because a crew moved in. 4 young men in a jacked-up black truck. They called themselves the Ridgeline Boys, which was a stupid name, and they knew it, and they didn't care. The leader was a lean kid named Dale Prather, maybe 26. Slicked hair, a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, and eyes that never quite landed on you straight. Dale had done a stretch in Florence for aggravated assault, and he came out meaner and smarter than he went in. Dale figured out something simple. In a town with no cops of its own, one deputy who covered 3 counties, and a whole street full of scared old people you could just take. You didn't rob a place at night and risk a shotgun. You walked in during daylight, smiled, and told a shopkeeper that Main Street had a new kind of insurance now. Pay a little every week and nothing bad happens to your store, your family, your dog. Fran at the hardware store paid. $200 a week. She cried the first time and then she just paid. The gas station paid. The little Mexican grocery paid. By spring, half of Main Street was bleeding money into Dale Prather's pocket, and nobody said a word, because the one time somebody did say a word, a man named Curtis who ran a tire shop over on 2nd Street woke up to find his shop a black shell and his truck flipped in a ditch. Curtis left town 3 days later. Didn't even sell the land, just drove off and never came back. So when Dale's black truck rolled up in front of the Coalfork diner on a Tuesday morning, everybody on that street knew what it meant, and everybody looked away. Dale came in with his 3 boys. Big kid named Boone who'd played some college ball before he got kicked off the team, a twitchy one they called Rat, and a quiet one named Miller who did whatever Dale told him. Roy was behind the counter with a spatula in his hand. 2 truckers sat in a booth. An old rancher named Pete nursed a coffee at the far end. Dale slid onto a stool, easy as you please. "Morning, Pops," he said. "Sure smells good in here." Roy set a mug down in front of him without being asked and filled it. "Coffee's on the house, food you pay for." Dale smiled. "See, that's what I want to talk to you about, paying. He took a sip. "You're about the last holdout on this street. Everybody else, they figured it out already. They pay their little insurance and everything stays nice." He set the mug down. "200 a week. And a place this size does the volume you do, I might even round it up. Call it 250. Roy wiped the counter, slow. "This is my diner," he said. "Built it, paid it off. I don't owe you anything, son." The word son landed wrong on Dale. His jaw tightened. Sarge lifted his head from the floor by the register, ears up, and let out a low sound in his chest. "Keep that mutt quiet," Rat said. Roy didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Dale. "You boys finish your coffee and go on. There's nothing for you here." And that was the moment it turned. Dale stood up slow. He looked around the diner, at the two truckers who suddenly found their plates very interesting, at old Pete staring into his cup. Then he looked back at Roy, and something cold moved behind his eyes. "You know what your problem is, Pops," Dale said. "You think you're the exception." He picked up his mug, and he threw it against the wall. That was the signal. Boone stood and kicked over the nearest table. Rat grabbed a napkin dispenser and hurled it through the front window, and the glass came down in a sheet. Miller swept a whole shelf of pie plates onto the floor. The truckers scrambled out the side door. Pete pressed himself into the corner of his booth, shaking. Roy came around the counter fast for a big man. He grabbed Boone by the collar and shoved him back into a booth hard enough to crack the seat. For half a second, everything hung there, and you could see it in Dale's face, a flicker of surprise that the old man had moved at all. Then Boone came off that booth swinging, and it was 3-on-1, and Roy took a shot to the ribs, then another, and Dale stepped in and hit him clean across the mouth, and Roy went down onto the broken glass. Sarge lunged. He caught Rat by the pant leg, 3 legs in all, and Rat screamed and kicked at him. And the dog held on until Roy said one word, low and hard from the floor. "Sarge, off." The dog let go. He backed up to the register and stood over the fallen old man, teeth bared, that low rumble filling the ruined diner. Dale crouched down next to Roy, grabbed a fistful of the old man's gray hair, leaned in close. "250 a week," he whispered. "We come back Friday, and if the money's not on this counter, we don't wreck the diner next time." He glanced at Sarge. "Next time we take the dog, and then we take you." He let go and stood. "Think it over, Pops." They walked out laughing. The black truck roared off down Main Street, and the Colfork diner sat there with its front window gone, its booths in pieces, and an old man on the floor bleeding into the broken glass. Roy got up. Slow. He pressed a napkin to his lip. He looked around at 22 years of his life smashed across the tile, and for a long moment he just stood there, breathing. Then he did something strange. He walked over to the pie case. Above it, in a plain wooden frame, hung a scrap of faded leather, a rocker patch worn soft with age, the stitching frayed at the edges. He straightened the frame where the fight had knocked it crooked, made it level again. Careful, like it was the only thing in the room that still mattered. Old Pete watched him from the corner. "Roy," he said, voice cracking. "Roy, you got to call somebody, the deputy, somebody." Roy touched the napkin to his lip and looked at it. Just blood. "I'll take care of it, Pete," he said quietly. "You go on home now." That evening, after the sun went down, Roy swept up the glass himself. He nailed a sheet of cardboard over the broken window. He set the booths back on their legs, the ones that still had legs. He got down on his knees with a rag and cleaned the blood off the tile, his blood, until the floor was spotless again. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat down at the counter on the one good stool, and Sarge laid his head across the old man's boot. Roy scratched the dog behind the ears. The town was quiet. The cardboard rattled a little in the night wind. And for a while it looked, to anyone passing by, like a beaten old man sitting alone in a wrecked diner, deciding whether it was easier to just pay Down the street, folks watched from behind their curtains, and they told each other maybe it was over now. Maybe Roy would pay like the rest of them. Maybe the worst was done. They were wrong. The worst hadn't even started, because at 10:15, a folded piece of paper slid under the diner's front door. Roy set down his coffee. Sarge lifted his head. Outside, an engine pulled away into the dark. Roy crossed the floor and picked up the note. 6 words in block letters. Friday. Or the dog burns first. Roy stood there holding it. And here's where everything changed, because it wasn't about a shakedown anymore. It wasn't about pride or $250 or a broken window. Dale Prather had just told an old man he was going to burn his dog alive. This was survival now, and not just Roy's. Roy folded the note once and set it on the counter. He walked to the back office to a desk he hadn't opened in years, and he pulled out the bottom drawer all the way. Underneath a stack of old tax papers there was a flat tin box. Inside the box, a single index card, soft and yellow with age. On it, a phone number written in a young man's handwriting. His own. He told himself 15 years ago that he'd never dial it again. That whole life was behind him, buried. He'd hung up the leather for good and become the man who flipped pancakes and fed hungry kids for free. That was who he was now. But some doors, once you open them, they don't close all the way. And that patch above the pie case was proof. Because Roy Merrick had a name most people in that world still spoke carefully. Before Coalfork, before the diner, he'd been Deacon, road captain of the Diablos del Sur, the deadliest Hell's Angels charter the Southwest ever produced. For 20 years he'd been the man who kept 100 riders in line, who rode point through storms and roadblocks and things worse than either. He'd walked away clean, retired, the only man that charter ever let leave standing up instead of in a box because of what he'd been to them. And every man who ever rode under Deacon still remembered one thing. If Deacon ever called, you came. No questions, no matter where you were, no matter how many years had passed. Roy picked up the phone. His thumb hovered over the numbers on that yellowed card. Sarge sat down beside him and looked up, ears forward like the old dog already knew. Roy dialed. It rang twice. Then a rough, sleepy voice answered, and Roy said just 4 words. "Tank, it's the Deacon." There was a long silence on the other end. Then the voice, wide awake now, said, "My God, where?" "Coalfork," Roy said. "Little town off the 60 east of the pass. I've got trouble, the kind that doesn't sort itself out." Another silence. Then Tank said, "How many riders you want?" Roy looked at the note on the counter, at the cardboard over his window, at his dog. "All of them," he said, and he hung up. "Now, if you've been with me this far, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one about the quiet men nobody should have pushed are exactly what this channel lives for, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. Because what came next rolled into Coalfork like weather. It started as a hum on the horizon, so low you'd feel it in your teeth before you heard it. Out past the ridge, somewhere in the black desert, a rumble gathered and grew. Not one engine, not 10, dozens. Sarge got up off the floor and walked to the cardboard window and stood there with his ears up, that stub of a tail moving because the old dog knew that sound. He'd heard it long ago in another life when he still had 4 legs and ran alongside a big man on a black Harley. Roy stepped out onto the diner's front step. The night air was cool, and down the long dark ribbon of the interstate 1 single headlight appeared, then 2, then a line of them, strung out for a mile, pouring toward Coalfork like a river of fire. He didn't call the deputy. He didn't call anyone else. He just stood there in the doorway of his diner, an old man in an apron, and waited for his brothers to come home. The first bikes rolled onto Main Street a little after midnight. Big machines, chrome dulled by desert dust, engines throbbing low. The riders were older men now, most of them. Gray beards, weathered faces, bellies bigger than they used to be. But there was something in the way they rode, tight and precise, no wasted motion, that told you these were not weekend hobbyists. These were men who had lived hard lives and survived them. They filled Main Street bumper to bumper, 40 bikes, then 60, then more still coming. Lights came on in the houses along the street. Curtains twitched. Folks who'd watched Dale Prather bleed their town dry now stood at their windows staring at something they couldn't make sense of. The lead rider swung his leg off a big black bike and pulled off his helmet. He was a mountain of a man, bald, a gray goatee, a neck like a fire hydrant. Tank. He walked up to the diner steps, and for a second the two old men just looked at each other. Then Tank pulled Roy into a hug that would have cracked a lesser man's spine. 15 years, Deacon, Tank said, his voice thick. 15 years and not a word, and then you call me in the middle of the night. He pulled back and held Roy at arm's length, and his eyes moved over the split lip, the bruise blooming along the old man's jaw. His face went hard. Who did this? Kids, Roy said. A crew. Been bleeding this whole town for months. Everybody's too scared to fight back. And they laid hands on you. Roy nodded, put me on the floor in my own place. He glanced back through the doorway at the wreckage. They said Friday they come back for the money, and if I don't pay, they burn my dog, then me. Tank looked at the note when Roy handed it to him. He read those 6 words, and then he handed it to the man behind him, and that man read it and passed it on, and it went down the line of riders, hand to hand, all the way down Main Street. And with every man who read it, something settled over that street. A cold and terrible quiet. They didn't know who you were, Tank said. It wasn't a question. No, Roy said, they didn't. Tank smiled, and it was not a friendly thing. Then I guess Friday they'll find out. But Roy shook his head. It's not Friday I'm worried about. He looked down the dark street. Dale Prather isn't the top of this. A crew like that running a whole town this smooth doesn't do it alone. Somebody's above him. Somebody with money and reach, moving into these little dead towns one at a time, buying up the fear and the land for pennies. Prather's just the muscle. He turned back to Tank. You cut off the hand, another one grows. I want the head. And there it was. This wasn't going to be a brawl in a parking lot. Roy wasn't just after 4 punks anymore. He was after the man who'd built a machine out of scaring old people, the man who'd burned Curtis out and driven him from town, the man who thought a place like Coalfork had nobody left to protect it. That was a bigger, colder thing entirely. Tank nodded slow. Then we find the head. He looked back at his men. Boys, we're gonna be here a few days. They didn't ride into town like an army. That was the smart part, and it was pure Deacon, even after all those years. Roy didn't want a war on Main Street with old folks caught in the middle. He wanted Dale Prather and whoever was above him to walk into something they couldn't walk back out of. So the riders scattered. Most of them rolled their bikes into the big empty barn behind the diner and out of sight. A few checked into the motel 2 towns over, and Roy did something that made Tank laugh out loud. Thursday morning, he opened the diner, cardboard still over the window, booth still cracked. He flipped the sign to open, fired up the grill, and started serving breakfast like nothing had happened. Word got around the way it does in a small town that the crazy old man had opened back up. And folks came. Fran from the hardware store. Old Pete. The kids who ate for free. They came and they sat in the wrecked booths and they ate Roy's pancakes, and they didn't understand why. But somehow the fear in that room felt a little thinner than it had the day before. Around noon, Rat and Miller drove by slow in the black truck, casing the place. They saw the cardboard window. They saw the old man behind the counter. They did not see the 60 men in the barn out back. They laughed and drove on and reported to Dale that the old fool was too broke and too proud to run, and that Friday would be easy money. Dale Prather liked easy money. And he made one phone call to a man in a glass office in Phoenix, a man named Victor Coyle who owned a development company with a nice clean name and a very dirty way of acquiring land. Coyle told Dale he'd come out himself Friday to watch the last holdout on Main Street fold. Coyle liked to watch. It was, in the end, the mistake that undid him, because it meant the head of the snake was going to drive right into Colfork on its own. Friday came. The black truck rolled onto Main Street a little after 9, and this time a second vehicle followed it, a silver SUV with tinted windows. Dale climbed out of the truck with his 3 boys, and from the SUV stepped a lean man in an expensive gray suit, sunglasses, soft hands that had never done a day of hard work. Victor Coyle. He leaned against his car and lit a cigarette and waited for the show. Dale swaggered up the diner steps and pushed through the door, his boys behind him. The diner was empty. No customers. Just Roy behind the counter, drying a glass with a towel, and Sarge lying in his patch of sun by the register. "Well, look at that," Dale said. "Old man cleaned the place up, almost." He walked to the counter and rapped his knuckles on it twice. "Friday, Pops." "Where's my money?" Roy set the glass down. "There's no money, Dale." Dale's smile flickered. "Now that's a shame, because you remember what I said about the dog." He nodded at Boone. "Grab it." Boone took one step toward Sarge. And that's when Roy set the towel down on the counter, real slow, and said, loud enough to carry through the whole building, "You boys should have asked around before you came back." The door to the kitchen swung open, and Tank walked out, all 300 pounds of him, a tire iron hanging loose in one fist. Behind him came another man, then another. The front door opened and men filed in off the street where they'd been waiting in doorways up and down the block. The barn out back emptied. And in under a minute, the Colfork diner and the sidewalk in front of it were full of 60 leather-clad men, gray-bearded and silent, forming a wall Dale Prather could not see past. The blood ran right out of Dale's face. Rat took a step back and bumped into a man built like a refrigerator, who did not move. Boone stopped halfway to the dog and stood frozen. Out on the street, Victor Coyle dropped his cigarette and reached for his car door and found 2 riders already leaning against it, arms crossed. Roy came around the counter. He walked up to Dale, who was suddenly a small thing in a room full of storms, and Roy pointed without looking at the wooden frame above the pie case, at the faded rocker patch. "You broke every window in my place," Roy said quietly. "You put me on the floor. You threatened to burn my dog alive. And in all of that, not one of you ever stopped to wonder why an old man with hands like mine wasn't afraid of you." He tapped the glass over the patch. "Diablos del Sur, road captain, 20 years. They called me Deacon, and every man in this room rode when I said ride." Dale's mouth opened, and nothing came out. "You picked the one diner in Arizona," Roy said. "You never should have walked into." Tank stepped up beside him, tapping the tire iron against his palm. "Here's how this goes," he said to Dale, almost gentle. "You're gonna give us every name, every shop you're squeezing, every dollar. And the man out there in the suit, the one who owns you, he's gonna sign back every piece of paper he stole from the folks in this town. And then you're all gonna drive out of Colfork and never come back. Or," he shrugged, "well, there's a lot of open desert out here, son, and 60 men who love this old man very much." It didn't come to killing. Roy wouldn't have it, and every man there knew better than to cross him on that, even after 15 years. But Dale Prather learned in the next few minutes exactly what fear felt like from the other side, and it broke something in him that never grew back. He gave up the names. He gave up the ledger, a little notebook where he'd written down every terrified shopkeeper and every payment. And when the riders walked Victor Coyle in from the street, pale and stammering about lawyers, Old Roy took one look at the man and understood him completely. A man who ruined towns from behind tinted glass and never got his own hands dirty. "You burned out a man named Curtis," Roy said. "Ran him off his own land." He leaned in close. "You're going to find Curtis, wherever he went, and you're going to make it right down to the last nail. And then you're going to sell every piece of Coalfork you stole back to the people you stole it from for the pennies you paid. And if you ever come back to this town or send anyone, I will make one phone call. And you already know what shows up when I do." Coyle signed everything, right there on the counter with a shaking hand and 60 men watching. The deputy showed up an hour later, called by Fran, and found a stack of signed confessions and a ledger that put Dale Prather and Victor Coyle away for a long, long time. The Ridgeline boys scattered to the wind. Dale did his time and, last anyone heard, works a night shift in a warehouse in another state and doesn't tell people his name. The bike stayed 3 more days. The men fixed Roy's window, better than new. They rebuilt the booths, fitted a new counter, painted the whole place. Fran got her $200 a week back, every dollar out of Coyle's frozen accounts. So did the gas station and the grocery and everyone else on Main Street. Curtis got a call from a lawyer telling him his tire shop was going to be rebuilt on somebody else's dime, and he came back to Coalfork that fall, and the first place he stopped was Roy's Diner. On the last morning, Tank and his men lined their bikes up on Main Street the way they'd come. The whole town turned out this time, not scared, just watching, waving. Fran cried again, but different tears this time. Tank pulled Roy into one more of those spine-cracking hugs. "You call sooner next time, Deacon," he said. "Don't wait 15 years." Roy smiled. "Let's hope there's no next time." "With you," Tank laughed, "there's always a next time." He put his helmet on. "But we'll come, you know we'll come. All you ever have to do is dial." Then he swung onto his bike, and one by one those old engines fired, that same low rumble that had rolled in off the desert in the dark, and the river of headlights that had come to save one man flowed back out of town the way it had come. Roy stood on his front step and watched until the last of them dropped over the ridge and the sound faded into the wide Arizona morning. Then he went back inside. He flipped the sign to open. He set a bowl of fresh water down by the register, and Sarge padded over on his 3 legs and drank, and then went and lay down in his patch of sun by the pie case, under the framed scrap of faded leather that hung level and straight on the wall. The regulars started coming in for breakfast. Old Pete took his stool at the end. A couple of hungry kids slid into a booth, and Roy slid 2 full plates in front of them and said, "Eat up, growing boys." The bell over the new front door jingled, sunlight poured through glass that no longer had any cardboard on it, and the grill hissed the way it had every morning for 22 years. Roy Merrick picked up the coffee pot. The same pot he'd reached for on the floor with blood in his mouth, when 4 young men who didn't know any better thought they'd found an easy old fool. He filled Pete's cup and his own, and he leaned against the counter he'd earned back, in the town he'd saved without ever raising his voice. Some men carry a power that has nothing to do with how loud they are, or how young, or how mean. It's quieter than that. It's the kind that spends 15 years asleep in a drawer and then answers on the second ring. Roy never wanted to use it again, but he'd have burned the whole thing down before he let them touch his dog. Outside, the last echo of the engines was gone. Inside, it was warm and the coffee was hot, and Sarge slept in the sun. And that was exactly how the old road captain wanted it.